Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ozgur, and we're all here for the photography, the shutter speed seminar, correct? Just making sure. Oh, great. Okay, we'll start in a second. So, who do we have here? What do you guys do? Are you photographers? Are you just interested in photography? Or did you not find anything else that was more interesting than this session? Or why are we here? What do you do? Photographers, mainly? Yeah? Do you all have your cameras? Not with you, obviously. Yeah? Okay. Well, nice to meet you. I'm a photographer as well. And today we'll just be talking about shutter speed. Of course, you can't talk about shutter speed just by itself. It has to relate to some other areas like the ISO of the camera, the aperture, the type of lens you have, lighting conditions, and the size of the chip that you're using, and what have you. But I'll try and focus mostly around shutter speed, and when we come to the other subjects, I'll try and explain what they are as well, really briefly. Okay, so let's start from the very basics. Today we generally talk about DSLRs, right? And this doesn't have to be, this shutter speed applies to any type of camera that you have, including your eyes. Okay, you can think of your eyelids as shutter speed. We'll explain how that works as well. But mainly today we're talking about, we're dealing with DSLRs. And anyone know what they stand for, DSLR? The letters stand for? Apart from you.
Digital single lens reflector.
Okay, that's great. Not reflector, digital single lens reflex. Okay, let's dig that down a little bit more. What does that mean? Why is it digital single lens reflex? Well, it's digital because it's not using a film, it's not analog. So it uses a little chip at the back of the camera as opposed to a pellicle film. That's why it's digital. And it's single lens. At this point you may be thinking, well, of course it's a single lens. Idiot. What else can it be? Well, it can be a twin lens reflex camera, which would look like this. Anyone seen one of these before? Most of the times that you see these in old movies and everything. This is called a TLR. It's a twin lens reflex camera, and this is how it works. Now, you as a photographer would be looking through this upper lens. Okay? So you'd be framing, positioning your subject and what have you through this upper lens. And the film that you had would be placed right behind this lower lens. And these two lenses would be interconnected. So if you were to say change the focus ring, if you were to rotate the focus ring on this lens, you will also rotate on that one, and vice versa. Now, right away, you might have noticed the big error there, and the error there was that of course, they couldn't share the same focal point, so they couldn't share the same perspective. Say, if you think of my face as the TLR camera, think my eyes are the upper lens and my mouth is the lower lens. And say I was to photograph this pen, okay, and I'm looking at the pen, perfect, but my mouth is looking at somewhere else. So if I was to try and frame something up close, for example, that'd be a big problem. If you were, of course, far away from your subject, it was less of a problem, because if this pen was here, it doesn't really matter if I do this or this, slightly, ever so slightly, and if it was landscape, hardly ever a problem. But as soon as you get to, a closer distance with the subject, then that's where it became a problem. That's why we don't use them anymore. Now we can still find them. You could probably get them in like the vintage shops for probably more expensive than you can get a decent DSLR, just because they're not around anymore that much, and not many people use them today. So they said, the developers said, we have to come up with an idea to let the photographer see what the film was seeing, or let the film see what the photographer was trying to frame. Okay, so they introduced this system called single lens reflex camera, and this is how that worked. Okay, well, this is your camera. Nice to meet your camera, nice to meet your audience. And inside the camera, this is what you have. Okay, so we have a set of lenses at the front, and your viewfinder is here. When you actually close your eye and look through the viewfinder, you're looking at here. You're looking through here. And if you just look at this, you're looking there. So that doesn't really help. You're still not looking at the same position, same thing as your lenses. So what they did is they introduced this shutter system in here, also included the set of mirrors, which is a term where the reflex term comes from. These red lines here are the mirrors inside your camera. And this is how it works. They serve for two things, those mirrors. One, I'll show you how exactly it works. One is to make sure that the photographer is looking exactly at what the lens is looking. Secondly, is that you're seeing everything the right way up. Normally, because the way the light travels, it doesn't bend, it travels in straight lines, and you can't bend light, you can break it, but you can't bend it. And because of that, I don't have a graphic for that, but I'll show you this. If I had this, I don't have a better subject, I'll just stick with this. If I had this pen right here in front of this lens, and the lens was trying to capture an image of this pen, all the light bouncing off this pen would go through this lens, okay? And normally, just ignore these red mirrors there. Normally, like I said, because of the way the light travels, it would just go and focus on this lens, on this set of lenses, and at the back of the lens, which is where you have your chip or your film, you'd get the image upside down. So instead of this, you get a reflection of this here upside down and inverted. So the wrong way around as well. Well, the lenses there, first, correct this issue, and secondly, they help you, like I said, see what the camera is looking at. And have you ever seen all those, like in old movies, they go under a big, like a tent-like camera, and they make everything dark, and they look through something, and it looks upside down, and they take a photograph, and they shake it off, and it looks all nice and handy. That's why it happens, because in those old cameras, they didn't have this mirror system in them. And this is what's happening. So the light, as represented by the by the yellow line there, goes through the lens, and it hits your first mirror. Okay. From the first mirror, that's a 45-degree mirror there. It goes up and hits the second mirror there, and from that second mirror, it goes down and hits this mirror. And as the photographer, then from that mirror, it goes right into your eye. And as the photographer, you're actually looking at a mirror when you look through that viewfinder. And that system here is called a pentaprism, because it has 5 sides. Okay, so this is how they assured that you're looking exactly at what the lens was looking at. Okay, and what happens when you press the shutter button, the button to take a photograph on your camera, is at the moment the film or the chip can't see anything because it's being blocked by this mirror there. As soon as you press that shutter button, or called the shutter release button, this mirror flips up and it lets the film or the chip see that ray of light. So this is me clicking that button now. Should I just play this back a bit smoother? Flips up, and the film is now seeing what the lens was looking at and what you were looking at. And because it flips up, it blocks your view for a blink of an eye. That's why when you take a photograph, it just goes black for that fraction of a second. If that fraction is longer, a couple of seconds, you can't see anything for a couple of seconds. If you ever, mess the settings up on your camera without really knowing, press a button and it goes black for like 25 seconds, and just wait and wait and wait. You can't even turn it off. You can't do anything. That's because you set the shutter button to be shutter speed to be that long, and that mirror stays up, and it lets the film or the chip get exposed by that many seconds. Okay. Then, as soon as that's over, as soon as the exposing is over, the mirror there goes back to its first position and waiting for you to take the next photograph. And that's why it's called a single lens reflex camera. Okay. And shutter speed is mainly measured in fractions of a second, or just full seconds, or say half a second. Most of the times on your cameras you'll see numbers rather than those fractions. So normally you'll be talking about, say, maybe 250th of a second, or 500th of a second, or 60th of a second. And on the camera, sometimes it says 1/60, or sometimes it just says 60, which means 60th of a second. So it just tells you that fraction. One really interesting thing about I'm just going back a little bit here with the way the light travels. You know how I said if the light's traveling in straight lines, you see everything at the back of that film upside down and the other way around. That's exactly how our eyes work as well. So if I'm just looking at you lot here, actually, at the back of my retina, the light bouncing off you, or of everything else that I'm looking, is visible at the back of my retina, upside down and the other way around. But one brain, all of our brains are smart enough to know that, and it converges it so that we see everything the right way up. If I was to wear a pair of glasses, I don't know where I can get them from, if I was to wear a pair of glasses, which would make everything upside down and the other way around, just wear them and you'll just feel dizzy for a while. After a couple of hours, your brain would readjust and you'd actually see everything the right way up again. And as soon as you take those glasses off, then you start feeling dizzy again because your brain is thinking, hold on, I just corrected them. What's everything, why everything's behaving this way? So the cameras aren't that smart, although I read somewhere recently that the average DSLR camera that you're holding in your hand today has a more advanced technology than they had for the first Apollo mission, the space shuttle they sent to the moon. But still, they're not that smart yet. Okay, so all good, shutter speed works that way, shutter mechanism works that way, but why do we use it? Why do I care? Why do I care what happens inside the camera? Why do I care if it stays open for that long rather than that long? Okay? Well, we care because as photographers, we're all trying to be creative and make our images look better. And when we're talking about shutter speed, another side note here, and I said your eyelids are like shutter mechanisms on the camera. On average, a blink of an eye is somewhere between 60th of a second and 100th of a second. So when you blink, it goes that fast. Now keep that in mind. That's a fast move, right? My eyelids do when I blink each time. It's a fast move. This fast movement can be multiplied by tens. So when we talk about shutter speed, we can talk about, say, 16,000th of a second or 8,000th of a second. And we see why that may be useful, or where it can become handy. Now, let's see what we can do. Just button up here. I can't see much here. Okay. Now, there's a buddy of mine. If we have that shutter speed going fast, like that, really fast, obviously faster than this. If we are going fast like that, what that will do is it will just capture the motion wherever it falls between that opening and closing. Okay? And say, for example, he was jumping here. I think this is something like, let's check how fast this was. Here you can see I set the shutter speed for this one for 1600th of a second. So what that did is, as the guy was on air, the shutter just went off. The camera just pressed the button and just did that and captured the guy on air, frozen. Now this is a fairly fast shutter speed. The opposite of this is a slower shutter speed. And if you're using a slower shutter speed, what happens then is your camera, your shutter, goes up and that mirror stays up, so you can't see anything, say, for maybe 2 seconds or as long as the shutter stays open. And everything that's moving during that period gets recorded onto your chip or onto your film. So say you had a camera there, that projector say was a camera, and it's pointing at me, and say it's exposing this image for 2 seconds. And I make a move from here to here, and it takes 2 seconds. What happens there is the film, of the back of the camera or the chip, is seeing me here, it's also seeing me here, also seeing me here, and everywhere here. So I appear as a blur. And this example, the cars started moving somewhere from here, and the shutters stayed open until they moved all the way down and went past. That's why they appear like a ray of lights going downward. Now there's one thing that may get you, and it's that one. This thing is a little bit different. This is not motion blur. This is what we call camera shake. Well, if you remember what I just said about moving objects and having the shutter stay open for longer, well, obviously London Eye is moving. Say, Big Ben there. That's not moving. Hopefully it's not. Gorgun at the back, that's not moving. They're not moving. Nothing's moving, but the image is blurry. This is a camera shake. What this means is the photographer couldn't hold the camera still as they were taking this photograph and shaking it ever so slightly maybe, but it still registers. So instead of, you can think of this, if you like, everything, the camera is still, everything in the photograph is moving by the same amount, which can't obviously happen, so the camera shakes a little bit, and it's an effect that you get. This is called camera shake, not motion blur. And there's no set rules for this, but as a rule of thumb, I'd say, if you go anywhere below 60th of a second with your shutter speed, you are in the red zone. You may get camera shake. But that's not, that depends on what you're shooting. That depends on how steady your hands are. That depends on the type of lens you're using. Some lenses today, they use the image stabilization technology. It'll be written on the side of the lens as IS or iOS. And with those ones, you can go lower. And it also depends on the focal length of the lens as well. So this becomes more of a problem if you're using, say, a zoom lens. If your focal length is, say, 200 millimeters, so if I'm standing here and taking a photograph of Martin there, say, at the back, and I'm trying to fill his head, fill the frame with his head that big, so I had to use a zoom lens, and say that's, I don't know, 120 millimeter lens. If you go anywhere below 120, if you're using that focal length, again, you're in the danger zone, as a rule of thumb. So what can you do in this case? Well, a couple of things. You can use a tripod, which would be the best solution. You can make sure that you're not on a shaker bridge, like we are here, so it doesn't shake around. Or if you don't have any of those, you can pump up your ISO, so your film becomes more sensitive, which will introduce more noise. And you can go, well, if your film becomes more sensitive using, say, ISO and more noise, it will become brighter, which is what we want. And to compensate that brightness, you can use a higher shutter speed to make the image darker, but capture the movement, capture the motion a lot quicker. Of course, if you go higher with the shutter speed, if you go, say, from 1 second shutter to, say, 100th of a second, so from here to here, the amount of light that you'll get will be a lot less. So the image will be a lot darker. So to compensate for that, you'll have to play with your aperture and your ISO. And let's see, this is how that looks like. Without going much into aperture and ISO, I'll just briefly tell you what they are. Aperture, you can think of aperture as the pupil in your eye. That controls how much light gets into your camera and how much light hits the back of your camera, say the chip or the film. Okay? It's a little opening like this, and it's measured in F numbers. So we can have it wide open like this, which will let more light in, which will result in a brighter image. Or if you have a smaller opening like this, it will let less light in, and of course your image will be darker. And at this point you may be thinking about, why am I going to get darker image if I can get a brighter one? This affects one thing, and that's the depth of field. And depth of field is the field in which your image appears to be in focus. I won't go into much detail in that. And you have ISO there at the back of the top of the triangle. And ISO, like I said, is the sensitivity of your film or your chip to light. So how sensitive is it? Why would I use it? Why would I care? Well, if you're in a room like this, it's way too dark for a, say, photograph to be taken without blurring anything, without using faster shutter speed. You can pump up your ISO to a higher number, which will compensate for the darkness. But the disadvantage of that, well, not disadvantage, but the payoff, if you like, of that is noise. You get these little specks of dots on your image, which are called noise, or if it was a film, it would be called grain. So the reason I'm mentioning these is you can't really talk about shutter speed or ISO or aperture by themselves. They all have to work in a conjunction like this. Now, let's talk about, okay, before we move on, I'll show you this one here. This image that we just saw used 0.8 seconds. So it was just a little less than a second to expose this. And of course, the photographer can't stand still for a second. And the result is shaky. Okay, this one is quite an interesting one. Okay, what can you tell me about this image? What does anything look blurry? Does anything look sharp? What can you tell me about this? Is there anything blurry in this image? You'd think. If you look at the clouds, well, the only thing that's slightly blurry, one is the clouds, And if you look at the water here, it looks like silky. Reason for that is everything was still, but the water and the clouds. Look, obviously the clouds were moving. If you look at the clouds in the distance there, they're less blurrier than the ones that are closer. Of course, I'm seeing the movement a lot more if they're closer. This picture has a funny story, well, interesting one rather. So I set the camera on the tripod. Actually, first I didn't set the camera on the tripod. I tried to put the camera at the tip of the balcony, and I said I'll give it a shot and see how it turns out. And I set it to, I think it was about 5 seconds. This one. I set it about 5 seconds on the shutter speed, and this was nowhere as bright as my eyes could see, because I couldn't see everything as bright as this with my bare eyes. I let my shutter speed stay open for 5 seconds, so I clicked the button, went up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and closed down. And everything was blurry. I said, okay, fair enough, 5 seconds, I couldn't hold it still. Even though I was resting it on the edge of the balcony, I couldn't rest it still. So I said, I need to use a tripod. So I picked my tripod up, set it up, put the camera on top of that, pressed the shutter button. 5 seconds later, my image was again blurry. Okay, there's something wrong here. And what I did wrong was when I was pressing down the shutter button, say this was my camera, pressing down the shutter button, ever so slightly, I couldn't even see it. I was just tilting this camera down a little bit like this. So I registered that shutter by clicking, and as I let go of my finger, it went back up like this. So it resulted in a blurry image, because it was recording everything in between that. I said, okay. I had this little device, the remote control. I said, I'll use that so I won't touch the shutter at all. I'll just use that. It's just like a self-timer, which I thought about afterwards. I said, I could just use the self-timer. So I got the remote control. I pressed the remote control. Didn't even touch the tripod. Again, it was blurry. I was like, what the heck is going on? So what I realized was it was a little bit windy. Okay, and the tripod was shaking ever so slightly. I couldn't really feel it much, but if I stuck my head out, I could feel then that it was a little bit windy. So there I was, high up in the balcony, leaning on the tripod to make sure that it wasn't shaking. And this little remote control I had would only work from in front of the camera. So leaning over the tripod, going over the camera like this, right, trying to get the photo down. Then that's when after that I thought I could have just used this half timer. Well, I wasn't smart enough then. So I pressed the remote control and made sure that the tripod didn't shake or anything. And after 5 seconds, I ended up with an image that looked like this. And I was getting late. I said, whatever, it looks all right. I'll leave it there. So the reason why I'm telling you this is it's so easy to get a blurry image if you're not careful. You definitely want to use a tripod. You definitely want to use a tripod which is not 15 pounds. If it's a 15-pound tripod from Jessop's or Jacobs or whatever, they tend to shake a lot. They break easily. You can't really set the levels properly, so you'll always get a tilted image which you have to then correct in Photoshop or whatever. So tripods are your best friends if you're doing night photography like this. This is another one. And this was exposed, I think this was like 10 seconds. Was it 13 seconds? 10 seconds? 13 seconds. Okay. And what can you tell me about this image? What do you think these streaks of lights are? Any ideas? Any guesses? Could be fireworks, yeah. Do you know those, I was going to say little, but they're not really little, the Chinese lanterns that they light up? Now, this was Guy Fawkes last year, the year before last, and this is what happened. I set my camera up on a tripod, I placed it there, made sure that no one was touching it, and when I set the camera, set the shutter speed for 13 seconds, that lantern, Chinese lantern, was here. Press the shutter button, lantern, click up, and start recording everything. And during those 13 seconds, this lantern went from here all the way towards here, just like the example we saw with the cars. That's why it looks like a streak of light. Now, the only thing that appears to be sharp in this image is this tree in the middle. The reason for that is that the tree was the only thing that wasn't moving. If it was windy, again, I'd get a blurry image on the tree as well. If you look at all these weird ghosty images of people there, that's because this girl, for example, here, when I first pressed the shutter button, she had her head still, then she moved it around, she wasn't standing still, then they all appear as blur. So if she kind of put her head here for, say, more than the rest of the movement, so she maybe stood there still for 2 seconds, that registers as a sharper image than the rest. Same thing with this one as well. And the only thing that was not moving here was, apart from the, of course, background here, was the tree. And this is a little bit interesting. If you look at the top of the tree there, the leaves are blurry, obviously blurry. But if you look somewhere here, it doesn't get sharper than this, because the root there wasn't moving as much as these branches were. Okay. Now, this is also interesting. Again, we're still talking about how fast the objects move and how it affects the end result. Now, this example, of course, will I have used a faster or a slower shutter speed in this one? Faster shutter speed.
Yeah.
Exactly, because I then would be able to capture, and I was able to capture all these kind of particles of water as particles. And so look, yeah, this is 4,000th of a second. Now imagine, I said your eyes, when you blink, it goes 60th of a second. That's fast. That's 4,000th of a second. That's a lot faster. Now, the very same image, I'm in the same position, same subject. I just changed my shutter speed to a slower one. This time, instead of having those particles of water, they look like that silky stream of water. Now, let's have a look at what this image used. This is half a second. The shutter speed here was set to half a second. So, as opposed to 4,000th per second, it's a lot slower. And if you look at here, it also tells us the aperture value. So, the aperture was small, which means that it was wide open like this. Okay? And I used a faster shutter speed, which gave me a good exposure. If I just changed my shutter speed without touching that aperture, if I just made this 4,000th of a second, if I just brought that down to half a second, everything would be white. Because I'd let more light in, well, I'll let more time to let that light hit my lens. So everything would be way too bright. To compensate that brightness, I had to make that hole, the aperture, smaller. So we have less light coming in more time, to get a result like this. That's why here I set my aperture to 25 as opposed to 3.5 here. Now this is if you change the settings on your camera. What if the subject is, your camera settings are exactly the same, but the subject changes its speed, like they do in this example. Now, it's another photograph here. The shutter speed here is set to 50th of a second. Yes, it is. Set to 50th of a second. And you'll see that the particles here are not so blurry. They're a little bit blurry, but you can still see bits of it going on around everywhere. Now, I didn't change the shutter speed. Just waited a little bit more. Actually, this is the second picture I was going to show you. This is the second version, so keep this in mind. I'll just show you this as well. The shutter speed is exactly the same, but the subject is moving a lot faster. This is exactly when that explosion happened. So it had that big blast going. That's why everything's blurry here. And the second image, the first one that we looked at, is when everything was coming down. So of course they slowed down. Because they're slower, then they appear sharper. Of course, if I use the faster shutter speed here, I would be able to freeze even more. Okay, let's talk about some extremes as well. Now, when would you go to say, why would you go to thousands and heavy with shutter speed? Well, this is 4,000th per second as well, this image. And obviously it doesn't get any brighter than this, right? I was pointing my camera at the sun, which is almost never a good idea. Well, that was a cheapish camera, so I said, what the heck. So, I was pointing the camera at the sun, and because it was too bright, I had to dial down my aperture. So I had a really tiny hole with my aperture to 29, f29, and it was still too bright. So I had to go ahead and dial down my shutter speed as well, so it was a lot faster. So I let as little light as possible with the aperture, and I kept it as fast as possible. That was as far as my camera would go at that time, 4,000th per second. And the brightest point, of course, is still the brightest point, it's the sun. But all these bits here, they didn't get any light, but actually they did. I could see it with my eye. Because I kept it really thick and I kept that hole really tiny, they appear as silhouettes here. Okay. And someone told me that this image looks like a like the Big Brother sign and the eye and people. I never realized it before they told me. So that's a really fast shutter speed. Here I have a really long shutter speed. There's no Photoshop done in this image. Believe it or not. It's a little bit freaky, I know. This one is, I think, about a minute. It's about 80 seconds, this one. And this is how I did that. I set the camera, this was in a studio. I set the camera, doesn't look as good as it does here, but well. I set the camera on the tripod in the studio, and I had a remote control, shutter control, and I set the camera's shutter mode to B, stands for bulb, which lets you control the shutter speed for as long as you want. You can leave it open for days. And actually they use that. I have a friend who's doing astrophotography, and they actually use those with big telescopes. They just expose something for 4 hours, 5 hours. They just press the button, have a sleep, go sleep, have a coffee and what have you, and fall asleep in front of the telescope, and it still records all that motion. So that's way too extreme. But in this case, this is already a really slow shutter speed, 80 seconds. What I did is everything was pitch black. I was having difficulties walking around, and I had 3 chairs there, empty chairs, and I framed it all nice when it was still light. I took that shutter release in one hand, and I had a flash gun in the other hand. So I pressed the shutter button, and the camera started recording. Because everything was black, of course, it didn't see anything. Now with that flash gun, I just went click. So a flash just popped up really quickly. And normally that happens about 125th of a second or 250th of a second. So during that period, of course, I was bright and everything else was bright. So the camera saw that and it captured it. Stood up, went to the next chair. This time I slowed that flash down. So this was the first one I did. This was, I think, like 250th of a second on that flash speed. So I slowed that flash down. I said, okay, even less light flash. And I brought it down to 125th of a second. And I sat down on that chair. I clicked the flash button again, and everything went for 125th of a second. And the camera saw that as well. But it wasn't enough to capture everything. It wasn't as long as this, the bright area. That's why I'm seeing through this area here as well. So I'm seeing through my body into that chair. Then I said, I'll make it even more. So I got a even weaker flash, if you like. Press the shutter button again. Press the flash button again. And it's really difficult here. But if you look really closely, maybe you may be able to see. You can clearly see on my laptop. No, you can't really see it here. I have another version of me here, which is really faded out. I get these funny little specks. Now, these are called noise. And if you have a longer shutter speed, you'll have more of those little funny specks here. And this is what causes those little funny specks. I'm trying to clear. Oh well, I'll try and draw it here in this area. Now, say this is you have the lights coming in, say from here, and you have your film. So the light hits the film. And say the signals that are being captured, they come up from the other end here, so you have your chip here. Okay. The signals that are being captured as color, they go like this. Of course, it's a little bit complicated than that. But and that's what you end up with. That's your photograph. If, say, it's too dark, you pump the ISO up, or if it's too dark, you bring the shutter speed up, so you enhance the luminance of that photograph. And what happens then is, instead of having these waveforms, you have waveforms that are like this, a lot larger ones. Then all you need is this much to create your image. Whatever is left outside this area, they form those little dusty specks on there, and they're called noise. It's like, most of the time, this is affected by the ISO the most, rather than shutter speed or the aperture. It's like listening to music in your car. If you can't really hear it very well, just turn the volume up. You can hear it well, but then you start hearing the background hiss as well, so you start hearing noise as well in the background. So that's something else to be careful about. This is another photograph, not one of mine, but it's a really interesting one. And this one you may think used a really fast shutter speed, but it didn't. What it did was to use a trigger to which was connected to the flash. So the shutter speed was set to, I think it was about a second here, 1.6 seconds. Okay, so it was quite long, so you just went click, click. And the trigger was sensitive to audio. As soon as it heard something like this, it would trigger the flash. So the camera was on a tripod, the exposure has been started, and the glass was dropped on the table, and as soon as the glass hit the table, the flash went, then it just captured that. Then the flash, of course, shut down. And although this was a long exposure, over a second, you still can freeze the motion, depending on how much light there is available to you. Okay, I'll skip this one. There are some creative uses of this of the shutter speed as well, apart from the very technical ones. This image, for example, there's no Photoshop done in this image. How do you think I could have achieved this image? Any guesses? Or anyone tried this before?
Were you moving?
Sorry?
Were you moving?
Could be, but I wasn't. But it would look the same. What I did was I set my camera to a slower shutter speed. Then I had a zoom lens on it, and I focused it right in the middle there. And I pressed the shutter button, and as the image was getting exposed, I just zoomed in to that. Sorry, in that one, I just zoomed out from the center. Of course, the center gets affected the least, this area, because it stays more or less where it is, and everything else zooms out towards that. If you were to do the opposite, to zoom in, all of these would look the other way, so they look like that. And with this, you have to have a slower shutter speed, and in this one, I used 1/6 of a second. Of course, if it was slower, then I could do that a little bit more slowly, that zooming action, and it would still look just as good. And in this one, again, the water there, this is a classic. They always use it, even like in Windows sample images or heavy. They always use this water looking like silk. And to achieve that kind of look, again, you want to make sure that your camera is set somewhere still. So I didn't have a tripod there. I just had to put my camera on a piece of stone there, just make sure, on a piece of rock, and make sure that it wasn't moving. So I had a slower shutter speed, can't remember how slow it was here, about 20th of a second, and everything that was moving during that period appeared as a blur. So it looks nice, but technically it's a false. So we're just seeing blur here, which looks nice. Okay, this one, you see this all the time with, say, F1 racing, or if there's a motor car racing, what have you. This is called panning. This technique is called panning. And what you do is you set your camera, preferably on somewhere still. In this case, I couldn't. I was on my feet. I had to hold the camera up. I didn't have a tripod. And you try and catch something that moves on a linear line. Okay? Of course, you can do this on something that doesn't move on a linear line as long as you're able to follow that. I'll tell you that in a second. And you set your shutter speed to a slower value. I think this was, what, 20th of a second? 10th of a second. And it depends on how fast the object is moving, how much light there is available to you, how steady your hands are, so all these conditions. And you put your camera in front of you, then you follow that subject that's moving on a linear line like that, and as it comes in front of you, you press the shutter button, you carry on following it, although you can't see it because you'll get that blackout. Although you can't see it, you carry on following that subject, and making sure that the subject stays more or less in the same area through your viewfinder. High five. So through your viewfinder, and if you let go of your, as soon as the exposure is over, it will look like the subject that was moving was the only subject that was not moving. So everything else will look like they were moving because you were panning this camera. Okay. Here's one more example. If you look at this one, then you'll see most of these people are still, apart from maybe say this bunch here, because they kept moving around. And if you look at the cars here, these are blurry, but this car isn't at all because that's the only thing that wasn't moving. That's the only car that wasn't moving. One last thing before I wrap up is, rather than, well, this is not a technical thing really, but more artistic if you like. You have to know when to press that shutter button as well. So it's a little bit risky. You want to wait for the right timing and want to make sure that you capture the right moment. And I have one here I can show you. Just skip this one. this one. So if this was exposed, say, half a second earlier or half a second later, the bird would probably be somewhere completely different. So you want to make sure that you know when to click that shutter button, and that, I'd say, would come with experience, and the more you take photographs, the better you'll get at it. And that would be more or less it. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, fire away. Any questions?
In low light conditions and stuff, how do you get like? Because I was taking photos of performance, and they were all banned and moving about and everything like that. It was low light, and the shutter stayed open for long, so it was very blurry. How do you compensate that without having noise?
You'd spend more money and buy a better lens, more expensive lens, which will let you open up the aperture a lot more. So say your lens lets you open the aperture up to say 3.5. So that's that big. And the reason why some of the lenses are so expensive is, say, on those zoom lenses they use for like football games or whatever. Those apertures can open up a lot wider than that, to say maybe 1.2 or something. So they can open up a lot wider than that. So you'll have more light in, which then you can use the shutter speed to compensate. So you can get a higher shutter speed and let more light in with that. If you don't, if you're not able to buy a more expensive camera, the best bet would be to make sure that your aperture is wide open, then your ISO is set to a high number. So you change your ISO setting to maybe say 800 or 1600.
Yeah, just about aperture. I think 1.0 is the closest to the human eye.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So if you think about the aperture, 3.5 is far away, but 1.2 is very close to what you see. So if you get a lens which is closer to 1, it's basically you will get what you see closer to what you see with your own eyes. So basically, at a low lit condition, concert, you get very close to it. But yeah, those lenses are quite expensive.
Yeah, they are.
I think the 1.8 lenses are fairly okay in price, but they are fixed lenses. You can't change the.
Yeah.
It's always give and take.
Exactly. Yeah. That's very true. And yeah, if they don't help, your best bet is to boost up your ISO, which will give you noise.
Yeah, but you can compensate noise in Photoshop. Yes.
Okay.
For that, Martin's your guy. So, okay, any more questions? Okay, well, thank you for listening, and hope you enjoyed it.